My name is Renata Osei, and I was 32 years old the night my father handed my brother a check for $240,000 across our dining room table and told me I was the kind of person who didn't need help. He didn't say it cruelly. He said it the way my father said most things, matter-of-factly, like he was reading from a document he'd already signed. You understand, he told me. Sons carry the name forward. You've always figured things out on your own. I nodded. I helped clear the plates. I drove home. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. I didn't cry that night. I didn't call my mother. I sat in my car in the parking garage under my building for about 4 minutes, and then I went upstairs and made tea and went to bed. What I did not know, what none of us knew sitting around that table, was that my father had made a separate set of decisions long before that dinner. Decisions he never discussed. Decisions he put in writing with a woman named Eleanor Marsh, a notary with an office on the 3rd floor of a building on Clement Street in San Francisco, and a filing date of March 14, 2019. Eleanor called me 3 weeks after my father's funeral. By the time she finished reading, my brother Marcus had stopped breathing normally. Welcome back to Chaniel, where quiet people let the paperwork do the talking. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe. New stories post every week, and the comments keep this whole thing alive. My father was a civil engineer. He spent 31 years at the same municipal firm in San Francisco, the kind of job where you show up before anyone else and leave after everyone's gone home. And the only way you know a man like that worked hard is because the infrastructure of an entire city quietly holds together. He didn't talk about money. He didn't talk about legacy. He talked about load-bearing calculations and soil compression ratios and once, memorably, a 12-minute speech at my college graduation about the structural integrity of bridges. I became an accountant. This is not a coincidence. I grew up watching my father move through the world with the specific competence of someone who had never once needed to raise his voice to be taken seriously. He was not a warm man exactly. He was a precise man. He was the kind of father who checked your math homework not to find errors but to understand your reasoning, and if your reasoning was sound, he would nod once and hand it back without comment. That nod was, in our household, the equivalent of a standing ovation. My brother Marcus was 4 years older than me. Marcus had our mother's ease, the kind of person who walks into a room and immediately knows whose birthday it is and what they want to hear. He was likable in a way that had always felt slightly effortless, and I had spent most of my childhood quietly admiring it from a distance the way you admire a skill you know you'll never have. He sold commercial real estate. He was good at it. He drove a car that required valet and owned a condo in Nob Hill and had a habit of picking up the check at restaurants in a way that made everyone feel generously hosted and, somehow, also slightly indebted. Our father loved Marcus in the uncomplicated way some men love their sons, visibly, with pride that didn't need to be explained. He loved me in the more complicated way some men love their daughters, privately, in a language I spent most of my life trying to learn. I am not telling you this so that you will feel sorry for me. I am telling you this because it is the context without which the rest of his story makes no sense. I had been on my own since I was 24. Not because anyone pushed me out, but because I had always understood, in the wordless way you understand things in families like mine, that the path of least friction was to need as little as possible. I put myself through my CPA licensing. I built a client base slowly, then less slowly, then in a way that surprised even me. By 32, I had a modest practice, 6 staff, a lease in the Sunset District, a reputation among small business owners in the neighborhood for being the accountant who actually read your financials instead of just filing them. I did not own a car that required valet. I owned a 2016 Subaru Outback with a cracked passenger side mirror I kept meaning to fix. My mother, Claudette, had passed when Marcus and I were in our 20s, a cardiac event, fast and without warning, which is the kind of loss that leaves you standing in a hospital hallway holding a paper cup of coffee thinking this is not something a person recovers from quickly. We did not recover quickly. My father did not recover at all, in the way that men of his generation sometimes don't, which is to say he continued to function perfectly and never mentioned it again, in any direct way. What he did do, and I would not learn this until much later, was spend the 18 months after my mother's death conducting a very careful, very private audit of his affairs. I know this now because Eleanor Marsh told me, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The anchor in my father's life, In the years after my mother passed was a woman named Iris Osei, my father's older sister, my Aunt Iris, who had immigrated to the Bay Area 2 years before my father did, and who had, by the time I was a child, become the fixed point around which our entire extended family revolved. She was 79 when my father died. She had a house in the outer Richmond that smelled like cinnamon and motor oil because she had, for 30 years, run a small auto repair shop out of the garage with her late husband Bernard, and she had never fully separated the two smells. Aunt Iris and I had always understood each other. I think it was because we were both, in our different ways, the kind of people who keep their own counsel. She had never needed to be the loudest person in the room to be the most important one. She drank her tea without sugar, wore the same 3 cardigans in rotation, and had opinions about everything that she delivered in a tone so calm they felt less like opinions and more like facts. She was also the only person in my family who had ever asked me, specifically, deliberately asked me, looking me in the eye, what I wanted. Not what I needed. Not what she could do for me. What I wanted. I told her once, when I was about 27, that I wanted a practice that was mine. No partners, no investors. No one's name above mine on the door but my own. She nodded. She said, "Your father built 4 bridges. Only one of them has his name on it. The other 3 have the name of the firm. He doesn't seem to mind. But I always thought that was a shame." I thought about that a lot. My father got sick in 2021. Not dramatically, a slow erosion, the kind that announces itself through small reversals. He stopped driving. Then, he stopped managing the stairs in his house in Daly City, without a hand on the rail. Then he moved into the back bedroom and didn't move out again. Marcus and I traded off weekends. I handled the finances. Of course I handled the finances, and Marcus handled everything that required being charming and coordinating, which was almost everything else. It was during this period that Marcus started talking about the business. He had been planning it for a while, he said. Commercial property management, a boutique firm, a niche market, a very specific clientele he'd been cultivating for years. He needed seed capital. He had investors, but he needed a foundational injection to close the structure. He'd been talking to Dad. I heard about this the way I heard about most things in my family, indirectly after the fact, from Aunt Iris, who mentioned it over the phone with the specific neutrality she used when she was telling me something she thought I should know without editorializing. "Your brother has been visiting your father every Tuesday and Thursday," she said. "He brings food. He stays a long time." "That's good," I said. "Yes," she said, and the pause after it was the kind that contained a sentence she'd chosen not to say. The dinner happened in November of 2022. My father had a good day, one of his better ones, and Marcus had suggested we all eat together, the 3 of us, at the house in Daly City. I brought soup and a loaf of bread from the bakery on Noriega. Marcus brought a bottle of wine and a folder. We ate. My father was quieter than usual but present, which by then felt like a gift. After the plates were cleared, Marcus opened the folder. He explained the structure of the investment. He walked my father through the projections. He was very good at this. Marcus had always been very good at making complicated things sound simple and simple things sound inevitable. My father listened. He asked 2 questions. Then, he picked up the pen Marcus had placed at the edge of the table, and he signed. The check was for $240,000. I did not know the amount until later. I found out because I was the one managing my father's accounts, and when the withdrawal cleared, I saw it in the ledger. I did not confront anyone. I updated the records and filed the transaction correctly and noted the purpose. Inter vivos gift, son, and said nothing. 3 days later my father called me. This was unusual. He rarely called. He said, "Renata, the money, you understand why I did that?" "Yes," I said. "Marcus needs a foundation," he said. "You've always built your own." "I know, Dad." "You're the one I never worried about," he said, which I understood was the closest he would come to saying I love you in this particular context, and I told him I understood, and we talked for another 4 minutes about the weather, and then he said he was tired, and I told him to sleep well, and we hung up. I sat at my desk for a while after that. My hands were in my lap. Something in my sternum had gone very still, not pain exactly. More like the feeling of setting something down that you've been carrying for a long time, and only just now noticing the weight. I did not call Aunt Iris. I called my client in Visitation Valley, who needed his Q3 reconciliation finished, and I worked until 9 o'clock and then I went home. My father died in February of 2023. It was a Thursday mid-morning, 11 weeks after his 81st birthday. Marcus was there. I was there. It was quiet, which was how my father would have wanted it, and I held his hand, and I memorized the way his hands looked, engineer's hands, large-knuckled, precise, because I knew I would need to be able to remember them exactly. The funeral was the following Saturday at a church in the Excelsior that my father had attended irregularly but faithfully for 40 years. There were more people than I expected. Colleagues I'd never met. A man who had worked on a bridge project with my father in 1987 who drove 4 hours to be there. The city councilwoman from the district where one of my father's bridges ran, who gave a 3-minute remarks that were genuinely good. Marcus stood at the front and accepted condolences with the ease of a man who is very comfortable being looked at. I stood beside him and shook hands and said thank you and meant it and felt the whole time like I was watching the proceedings from a slight distance. The way you watch something you're standing in the middle of, but haven't fully arrived at yet. Aunt Iris found me afterward, near the back of the hall. She hugged me for a long time without saying anything. When she pulled back, her eyes were dry. Mine were not, but only just. There are things that will come clear, she said. Give it a few weeks. I didn't know what she meant. I assumed she meant grief. That it would clarify, settle, become a shape you could work around. I did not know she meant it literally. The weeks after the funeral were administrative. This is what no one tells you about losing a parent. The paperwork arrives immediately and keeps arriving, and if you are an accountant, the paperwork falls to you by a kind of gravitational logic that no one discusses, but everyone understands. I notified the relevant institutions. I canceled subscriptions. I coordinated with the firm that handled my father's pension. I arranged for the utilities on the Daly City house to stay on through the estate process. I communicated with the probate attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch who had an office in the Sunset and had handled my father's affairs for 20 years. Gerald was efficient, pleasant, and thorough. He had a copy of my father's will. He had reviewed it with my father 3 years prior, he told me, and the distribution was straightforward. The house, the remaining investment accounts, and the personal property were to be divided equally between Marcus and me, with a specific bequest to Aunt Iris of my mother's jewelry and a rocking chair that had been in the family since before I was born. Marcus seemed satisfied with this. He and Gerald spoke twice by phone. Marcus told me the estate was uncomplicated. He used the word clean. He said he thought we could have everything resolved within 4 months. I said that sounded right. On a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of March, my cell phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. San Francisco area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. I was in the middle of a payroll review, but something made me pick up. Ms. Osei. A woman's voice. Professional, measured, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who delivers information for a living and has learned to deliver it without effect. This is Eleanor Marsh. I'm a notary with an office on Clement Street. I notarized a document for your father in March of 2019. I've been trying to reach you. I set down my pen. I'm sorry for the delay, she said. I reached out to the number I had on file first, which was no longer current. Your aunt gave me your cell. Aunt Iris. Give it a few weeks. What document? I said. A declaration of trust amendment, Eleanor said. Your father came in alone. He was very clear about what he wanted. He asked me to contact you directly in the event of his death, rather than routing through the primary estate. A brief pause. He said, and I'm reading from my notes here, my daughter will understand what this is when she sees it. She's the one who reads the whole document. Something moved in my chest, not sharp, more like a lock turning in a door that had been closed a long time. I'd like to send you a copy, Eleanor said. And then I'd like to schedule a time to read it with you in person. Your father requested that the reading happen with any interested parties present. Meaning Marcus, I said. Meaning anyone who holds an interest in the estate, she said carefully. I'll let you determine who that includes. I scheduled the meeting for the following Friday. I called Marcus that evening. Dad's notary called me. I said. A pause. What notary? A woman named Eleanor Marsh. Clement Street office. She notarized something for Dad in 2019. Another pause, slightly longer. I don't know anything about that, Marcus said. His voice had a texture I recognized. Not quite irritation, not quite alarm. Something between the two. Fitch handles the estate. Whatever she has, it should go through Fitch. She said Dad specifically asked her to contact me directly. I said. Silence. I've set a meeting for Friday, I said. I'd like you to be there. He said he'd check his calendar. He called back 40 minutes later and said he could make it. His voice by then had settled into something that sounded almost casual, which was how Marcus sounded when he was working to sound unconcerned. I did not say anything about what Eleanor had told me. I went back to my payroll review. I finished it by 8 o'clock. I drove home and parked the Outback and sat in the garage for longer than usual, looking at the cracked passenger side mirror in the rearview reflection. I thought about my father's hands. I thought about the way he'd handed Marcus the pen at the edge of the table. I thought about Aunt Iris and her 3 cardigans and the way she'd said give it a few weeks with the particular calm of someone who already knew what the weeks were going to bring. My father had built 4 bridges. Only one of them had his name on it. I understood, sitting there in the parking garage, that I had been wrong about which one. Eleanor Marsh's office was on the 3rd floor of a building on Clement Street, above a tea shop and a framing store. The building was old in the way San Francisco buildings are old, slightly tilted, slightly resilient, the kind of structure that had survived several things it probably shouldn't have. The waiting room had 3 chairs and a window that looked out onto the street and a framed print of the Golden Gate that was crooked by about 4 degrees, which I noticed immediately because I am who I am. Marcus arrived 4 minutes after me. He was wearing a jacket I hadn't seen before, slate gray, well-fitted. He looked like a man attending a meeting he expected to control. He sat down beside me and asked if I'd eaten, and I said yes, and we did not speak again before Eleanor came to the door. She was in her early 60s, I thought. Gray hair cut efficiently. Reading glasses on a cord. She had the presence of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people received news they hadn't anticipated and had developed a corresponding steadiness. She shook our hands. She thanked us for coming. She showed us to a small conference room with a rectangular table and 4 chairs and a window with the blinds half drawn. She set a folder on the table between us. I want to begin by explaining the context, she said, so there's no confusion about the nature of this document. She told us that my father had come to see her in March of 2019. He had come alone, without an attorney, and he had been explicit that he did not want the document routed through his primary estate attorney. He had prepared the amendment himself. She could see, when he brought it in, that it had been drafted with significant care. He had reviewed her notarization process. He had asked her 3 questions, all of them precise. He had signed in her presence. He had asked her to retain the original and to contact me, his daughter, directly following his death, and to schedule a reading with any interested parties at my discretion. He was very organized, she said, and very specific. Marcus shifted in his chair. Just slightly. His jaw had a quality I recognized, the set of it when he was performing patience. What does it amend? He asked. Eleanor opened the folder. Your father established a revocable living trust in 2007, she said. The primary trust document was held by his estate attorney and is the document you're both familiar with. This amendment was made to a separate schedule, Schedule B of the trust, which governs the disposition of real property not covered under the primary distribution. She turned a page. In 2019, your father owned 3 properties outright, she said. The residence in Daly City, which is in the primary distribution. A vacant lot in Marin County, purchased 1993. And a commercial property in the Sunset District, purchased 2001. The commercial property. I had driven past that building hundreds of times. 3-unit mixed use on Irving Street, retail on the ground floor, 2 residential units above. I had known it was my father's. I had processed the property tax statements. I had assumed it was in the primary estate. Marcus had assumed the same. I could see it in the way he was sitting very still. Schedule B, Eleanor continued, assigns the Marin County lot and the Irving Street commercial property in their entirety to Renata Ajoa Osei. She looked up. That's you, she said to me, not unnecessarily, just confirming. The amendment was recorded with the county in April of 2019. The properties transferred to your name upon death by operation of the trust. No probate required. The silence in the room was the kind that has weight to it. Marcus said, "That's not," and then stopped. Eleanor looked at him with the patience of someone who has watched people arrive at difficult information many times and has learned that the first sentence is rarely the sentence they mean to say. "The Irving Street property," I said. My voice came out level. "What's the current assessed value?" Eleanor consulted a page. "The most recent assessed value for property tax purposes is listed at $1.8 million, she said. "Market estimates in the corridor run higher, but that's the county figure." Marcus's hands, which had been flat on the table, moved to his lap. "The Marin lot," I said. "Assessed at $430,000, she said. "It's raw land. 11 acres. The room continued to be very quiet. "I have certified copies for both of you," Eleanor said. She slid 2 packets across the table. "The originals are filed with the county. There's nothing to contest procedurally. The amendment was validly executed, properly witnessed, and recorded. Your father was assessed for competency in 2018 by his physician, and the documentation confirming that assessment is attached as Exhibit C." She had thought of everything. My father had thought of everything. I understood, with a precision that felt like something settling into alignment, that the 2018 competency assessment was not incidental. My father had obtained it deliberately. He had then waited a year and made his amendment and filed it and told no one. He had been an engineer. He had understood load-bearing. He had known exactly which part of the structure needed to be built first. I picked up my copy of the packet. I turned to the signature page. My father's handwriting was there, the same careful, deliberate hand that had checked my math homework, that had held my mother's at the end, that had signed a check for my brother across a table in Daly City, while telling me I was the kind of person who built her own foundation. He had known even then. He had known 4 years before that dinner that this document existed. He had been telling me something I hadn't understood how to hear. "You've always figured things out on your own." He hadn't been dismissing me. He had been confirming what he already knew about me. I set the packet down. Marcus said, "I need to speak to Fitch." "Of course," Eleanor said. "The document is a matter of public record. Mr. Fitch is welcome to review the county filing." "There has to be something," Marcus started. "The amendment was properly executed," Eleanor said. Her voice did not change in register or temperature. She was not unkind. She was simply accurate. "Your father was of sound mind and body. The competency documentation is attached. The recording is confirmed. This is not a contested matter. It's a recorded fact." Marcus stood up. He thanked Eleanor, muscle memory, some version of courtesy that operated independently of whatever was happening in the rest of him. He shook her hand. He picked up his copy of the packet without looking at it. He looked at me once, briefly, before he left. I don't know what he saw. My face, I think, was doing very little. The thing in my sternum that had gone still in my car that November evening had not moved. I was sitting in a notary's office on Clement Street looking at my father's signature and thinking about bridges. I thanked Eleanor. I asked if there was anything else she needed from me. "Nothing at all," she said. "Your father made everything very clear." I went downstairs. I walked out onto Clement Street. The tea shop below Eleanor's office was open. I could smell it through the door. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the March light, which was the particular thin gold color San Francisco light gets in early spring, and I watched a bus go past. And then I walked to the Outback, which I had parked half a block down, and I drove to my office. I had a client meeting at 2 o'clock. A restaurant owner on Terraville who needed help restructuring after a rough quarter. I reviewed his file for 40 minutes. I ate half a sandwich at my desk. I was present for the meeting, I listened carefully, and by the end of it we had a plan that I genuinely thought would work. My phone had 7 missed calls by 5 o'clock. 3 from Marcus. 2 from my cousin Delia, who lived in Oakland and who had, as far as I knew, not been told anything about this meeting. 1 from a number I didn't recognize that turned out when I called back to be Marcus's wife, Simone, who said she was calling on his behalf and asked if I could please call Marcus back because she paused. He was having a very difficult afternoon. The seventh call was from Aunt Iris. I called her back first. Eleanor reached you, she said. Not a question.
She did, I said.
A pause. Your father asked me to be available today, she said. In case you needed someone to talk to. I'm all right, I said. And then, because I wanted her to know I understood. He told you. He told me in 2019, she said. He wanted someone to know where the document was. In case.
She paused.
He said, and here her voice changed slightly, lost a fraction of its evenness. He said you were the one who always read the whole document. He said he wanted to make sure the whole document got read. I sat in my car, in the parking garage under my building. The cracked passenger side mirror caught the garage light at an angle that made it look like a clean break rather than a fracture. He was right, I said. He usually was, Aunt Iris said. We talked for 22 minutes. About nothing in particular. About the church in the Excelsior and the man who had driven 4 hours. About a bridge in the financial district that my father had worked on in 1994 that Aunt Iris had always liked the look of. When we hung up, I went upstairs. I made tea. I stood at my kitchen window and looked out at the city my father had spent his career holding together, girder by girder, calculation by calculation, patient as a man who understood that the most important structures are the ones you build before anyone thinks to ask for them. Marcus called 11 times over the following week. I returned 2 of them. The first was a practical conversation. I told him I had spoken with a real property attorney, I confirmed that the amendment was airtight, and I answered the 3 procedural questions he had about the trust schedule as accurately and dispassionately as I could. He asked if I would consider a buyout arrangement for the Irving Street property. I told him I would think about it. The second call was harder. His voice had lost the control it had in Eleanor's office. He said he didn't understand why Dad would do this. He said he'd spent 3 years at that house, every Tuesday and Thursday, and he'd been there. He'd been present. He asked me if I thought that counted for nothing. I told him it counted. I told him I knew he had been there. I told him I thought Dad had known that too. Then why, he said. I thought about how to say it. He wasn't punishing you, I said finally. I don't think this was about the money he gave you. I think he knew you'd be fine. I think he was correcting something. Correcting what? I didn't answer immediately. Outside my office window, Noriega Street was doing its mid-morning thing. Delivery trucks, a woman with a stroller, the usual machinery of a neighborhood running. He was an engineer, I said. He built things to last. I think he wanted to make sure the load was distributed correctly. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's very like him." "Yes," I said. "It is." We didn't speak for about 6 weeks after that. Not from hostility, more from the need for distance that sometimes follows a shift in a structure you've lived inside your whole life. The shape of things had changed, and we both needed time to understand the new dimensions. Simone called twice. The first time she was upset in the way people are upset when they've been told their plans require revision. The second time she was more measured. She asked me again about the buyout option on Irving Street. I told her I was in the process of evaluating the property and wasn't in a position to discuss terms yet. What I did not tell her was that I had already met with a commercial property manager I used for my practice's lease, a woman named Dorinda Park who had 15 years of experience in San Francisco mixed-use properties, and that Dorinda had spent 40 minutes walking me through the Irving Street building and had looked at me afterward with an expression of frank professional assessment and said, "Whoever held this ran it conservatively. You have room to optimize significantly." "That was my father," I said. She nodded. "You can hold it, lease it differently, or sell into a very good market. Any of the 3 works in your favor." She paused. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking my father built things to last," I said. She looked at me for a moment.
"Then hold it," she said.
I held it. The Marin lot I was less certain about. 11 acres of raw land in Marin County is not a simple asset. It is a decision, and it requires the kind of patience I was not certain I had in the right form yet. I engaged a land use consultant. We walked the property on a Saturday in April. It was a clear day, the kind that makes Marin look like a different planet from San Francisco. quieter, greener, the bay visible from the ridge as a strip of silver in the distance. I stood on the highest point of the lot and thought about load distribution, about the way my father had looked at a piece of land and seen not what it was, but what it could hold. I thought about a woman running a quiet accounting practice in the Sunset District who had wanted, since she was 27 years old, a building with her name on the door. I called Dorinda from the ridge. The Marin lot, I said. If I held it 5 years and then developed it, residential, what would I be looking at? Tell me the acreage, she said. 11 acres, I said. Raw. A pause. In Marin? In Marin. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Call me when you're ready, she said. We have a lot to talk about. By June, Marcus had retained his own attorney to review the trust amendment. I knew this because Gerald Fitch called me to let me know, professionally, as a courtesy. He said he didn't anticipate any complications. He said the document was clean. Your father was thorough, Gerald said. Yes, I said.
He was.
The attorney Marcus retained reviewed the filing, the competency documentation, the chain of title, and the notarization record. In late July, Marcus's attorney sent a letter to my attorney confirming that no challenge would be filed. My attorney called to tell me. She said the word clean again. I was beginning to think this was a theme. Marcus and I had dinner in August. His idea, he called and asked, and I said yes, and we met at a restaurant in the Sunset that we'd been going to since we were teenagers, a Cantonese place on Irving Street that had been there so long it had become a kind of landmark without anyone formally designating it as one. We sat in the back booth. We ordered the same things we had always ordered. He looked tired. Not defeated. Marcus was not the kind of person who defeated easily, but tired in the way people look when they've spent a few months arguing with a fact and finally arrived at the fact. I've been thinking about what you said, he said. About load distribution. What about it? I think maybe I was the one he worried about, he said. He said it without bitterness. Just as a thing he'd figured out. Not in a bad way. I think he thought I'd be fine either way. That the 240 would be enough of a start, and that I'd be fine, and that the rest could go to you because he paused. Because you'd use it the right way. You'd use it the right way too, I said. Maybe, he said. But I already had a foundation. He looked at me. He told you that you build your own. And then he gave you materials. I didn't say anything for a moment. The restaurant was doing its Friday night thing. Full, warm, the particular controlled noise of a room full of people eating food they love. He gave us both what he thought we needed. I said finally. Marcus picked up his chopsticks. I know, he said. I'm just getting around to being okay with it. We ate. We talked about other things. When the bill came, we split it exactly. It is November now, 9 months since Eleanor Marsh called my cell and read me my father's handwriting. The Irving Street building has a new lease structure. One of the retail tenants renewed at a higher rate. The 2 residential units are generating the kind of steady return that a building held conservatively for 20 years tends to generate when someone finally reads the whole ledger. The Marin lot is still raw. I have a meeting with Dorinda and the land use consultant scheduled for next month. I have time. Aunt Iris had dinner at my place 2 weeks ago. She brought a bottle of wine she had been saving for a specific occasion and declined to tell me what that occasion had originally been. She wore the blue cardigan. We ate at my kitchen table and talked for 4 hours about everything except my father, and then at the very end, standing at the door with her coat on, she said, Bernard always said the best structures are the ones that take care of themselves once you build them right. Dad used to say something like that about bridges, I said. They talked about it, she said. Your father and Bernard. Many times. She hugged me goodnight. I watched her walk to her car, which was a perfectly maintained 2009 Civic that Bernard had serviced and that Aunt Iris had not stopped driving on the grounds that it ran fine, and there was nothing wrong with something that runs fine. I closed the door. I made tea. I stood at my kitchen window and looked at the city in the dark and thought about what it means to be someone your father never worried about. For a long time I thought it was the quiet version of being overlooked. I understand now that it was the specific form of confidence, not the loud kind, not the kind that announces itself across a dinner table, but the structural kind. The kind that says, this will hold. This is built right. This does not need me to add anything. My father built 4 bridges. 3 of them carry other names. 1 carries his. I'm going to put my name on a building. It is on Irving Street. It is on a block I drove past 1,000 times without understanding what I was driving past. My father knew I'd figured out. He just made sure I'd have somewhere to stand when I did. That's my story. A notary's phone call, a trust amendment recorded in 2019, and a parking garage where I sat for 4 minutes and then went upstairs and made tea. If you were sitting in that conference room on Clement Street, if you were the one holding your father's signature on a document no one had told you existed, would you have called Marcus back that first day? Or would you have given him the week to sit with it? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.